Hello everyone and welcome back to the main stage here at MagicCon Las Vegas. Our next panel is upon us and it's set to be an absolutely fantastic one. You're all people of great taste and refinement for having chosen to join us here at the main stage for the 20 worst mechanics in Magic's history. Presented by a man I presume is responsible for at least some of, I guess we'll find out. Maybe he's going to absolve himself. Oh no, it was the underlings. It was the junior designers that came up with these stinkers. We're going to find out because from Wizards of the Coast, please put your hands together and join me in welcoming to the stage the one, the only, Mr. Mark Rosewater.
Okay. I promised my wife when I started I would do a picture, so we're all going to be in the picture. So everybody, raise your hands. Okay, we're going to talk about the 20 worst mechanics. Let me plug my phone in. Oops. Okay. Okay. Why is it showing MagicCon? Hold on one second. Do you guys see my slides? Do you see the 20 worst mechanics? Oh, you do? Oh, I don't see it, but you guys see it. Okay. So, welcome to my, I'll introduce myself. I am Mark Rosewater. I'm the head designer for Magic. In Chicago earlier this year, I did a speech, the 20 best mechanics of all time. These were the 20 best mechanics of all time. Okay, well now in Las Vegas, I felt, using Isaac Newton's third law of motion, I needed to do the 20 worst mechanics of all time. So that, by the way, is an example of physical humor. Okay. Okay, the 20 worst mechanics of all time. Wah, wah, wah. So what exactly does that mean? So let me lay down some ground rules. First of all, this is all my opinion. My panel, my opinion. I'm the head designer. I'm judging mechanics based on how they function from a design perspective. Power level, I don't care. Wordiness, I don't care that much. How often it's played, I actually don't care that much. On popularity, that one I care a little bit about. Okay, so I'm looking for bad gameplay. I'm looking for limited design space. I'm looking for confusion and just things that are not fun to play. What mechanics just make Magic a worse game? Okay, there are a number of things I've chosen to exclude. First of all, no evergreen mechanics. No tools. What I mean by that is no mana symbols, no card frames, no templating. No card types, so I'm not going to talk about super types or subtypes. And only keyworded mechanics and ability words. I had Ristic on my list for a while, and then I realized it's not a keyworded thing. So, okay, with that out of the way, on with the bottom 20. Okay, number 20. Daggers in my heart. Stickers. So this was from Infinity in October of 2022. So when you think of booster packs, I go back to my youth, and I think of booster packs of my youth. And one of my favorite was wacky packages. So for those that don't know, these were stickers or like parodies of products. But I associate opening up booster packs with stickers. And there's a lot of games that make use of stickers. Legacy games are very popular. So the idea was, hey, it's a wacky unset. Let's do something out of the box. So we made stickers. So there were name stickers that could change the name. There were art stickers that you could add to the art, and there were cards that cared about art. There was ability stickers that could add abilities to cards. And there were power toughness stickers that could overwrite power and toughness. And then you could put them on your card, and you could change what the card did. Okay, so what was the problem with stickers? Was it gameplay? No, I actually think they played really well. It's a fun mechanic. Is there tournament issues? Well, there was one card. But other than that one card, There weren't that many tournament issues with them. Mostly they're not played in tournaments. Was there complexity issues? Well, if I did it again, maybe I wouldn't do name stickers, but in general, no. I don't think there was a complexity issue. So what was the problem? Glue. Now, in my talk in Chicago, I talked about metaphorical glue, like in Typal. For Typal themes, you need metaphorical glue. I do not mean metaphorical glue, I mean actual glue. So one of the problems is what I'll call logistics. A mechanic is not just how it plays, it's all the things you have to do to play it. And the problem with stickers, so our goal with stickers, number one goal was don't hurt the card, right? People like their cards. Like in the very first Unglued, the two worst rated cards were Blacker Lotus and Chaos Confetti. Why? Because you rip up your cards. People do not like hurting their cards. The number two goal was we wanted them to be reusable. So we tried a lot of different things, but we only got so many tests with them. Also, COVID, the glue factory went out of business because of COVID. We had all sorts of issues. So the key is they were hard to get off. They wouldn't restick to the sticker sheet. And because of that, they were easy to lose. You just would lose them. So the key to this was, I think they were fun to play, but they were hard to play with. And that is why logistics is important. And the reason stickers is on my list is it doesn't matter if the core mechanic is fun if what you have to do to play with the mechanic isn't fun. So that's number 20, stickers. Number 19, Megamorph. So Megamorph is from Dragons of Tarkir back in March of 2015. So just to remind you, it was back when we had blocks. So Khans of Tarkir was a large set. Fate Reforged was a small set, and then Dragons of Tarkir was a large set. So I came up with a cool idea for a block structure. I said, what if you drafted Khans with Fate Reforged, and then you drafted Fate Reforged with Dragons of Tarkir, but you never drafted the two big sets by themselves? Okay, so the question was, how do we do that? So this happened right after the second Great Designer Search. Ethan Fleischer won. Sean Main came in second. We hired both of them. The third person, by the way, is named Scott Van Essen. We later hired him. He works on Duel Master, so he's also at Wizards. So I said to them, what's going on here? Why are you drafting these together but not these together? Like, what's happening? We have to make sense of it. So we started the first ever exploratory design team. And it went so well, it became a core part of our design. We just kept doing it. So the solution we came up with was time travel. So the idea was, Khans is present day, Fate Reforged is the past, and Dragons of Tarkir is an alternate timeline. So these two are the original timeline, and these two are the new timeline. It made sense of everything. So in the story, Sarkin Val, a planeswalker, he loves dragons. Loves dragons. And he's from Tarkir. But on Tarkir, the dragons had been killed off by the Khans. Why? Because of an event that happened many years ago. Nicol Bolas and Ugin, who are brothers, by the way, they're twins, had a fight, and Nicol Bolas killed Ugin. Ugin died. And because of that, all the dragon storms went away, and all the dragons got killed. And so once the Khans killed the dragons, there were no more dragons. But Sarkin Val didn't like that. So he used Ugin's Nexus to travel back in time and save Ugin and bring back the dragons. Okay, so this was the thing we were trying to represent. So the idea was, okay, what if the first set used an existing mechanic, the second set did a proto version of it, like we went in the past, and then the dragons, because it's an alternate timeline, did a tweaked version. That was our idea. Okay, so now we have to go back. In Alpha, Richard Garfield made two cards, Illusionary Mask and Camouflage. These two cards played creatures face down. And we didn't quite know what that meant. So the rules team, this is the best picture I had of the rules team. The rules team came up with a way to solve it, and they ended up making a mechanic called Morph. So the way Morph works is you can play this card face down as a 2/2, and then you could pay its morph cost to turn it face up. So we first did it in Onslaught. We brought it back in Time Spiral. So when we were thinking about it, I really liked Morph as this. So the existing mechanic would be Morph. The proto mechanic, we made something called Manifest. And Manifest, you put a card from somewhere face down as a 2/2 creature, and then if it's a creature, you can turn it face up for its mana cost. An idea we like so much, we recently tweaked it as Manifest Dread in Duskmourn that's out now. The question was, what was our third mechanic? It needed to be tweaked. So we wanted to do Morph, but with a twist. So we came up with a really cool idea that we called Smorph. So the way Smorph worked is you paid 4 mana for a face-down 2/2, and you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So instead of being 3 mana for a 2/2, it was 4 mana for a 3/3. And then when you flipped it up, if you had gotten the Smorph cost, it was 1 bigger. I liked Smorph a lot. The problem was it didn't play nicely with Morph. Because if you play a Morph face down, it doesn't have a +1/+1 counter on it. If you play a Smorph face down, and so they didn't go together. I personally didn't care about that. I was outvoted. Smorph was killed. So we ended up with Megamorph, which was a compromise. So Megamorph didn't have the 4 mana for the 3/3 part, but it did have the +1/+1 part. So if you played a Megamorph, when you turned it face up, you got a +1/+1 counter. Okay. The problem with this mechanic is what I will call an expectation problem. Because Megamorph actually plays well. It was played in tournaments. It's actually a fun mechanic. But we do a thing called a set assessment, where we ask players about the latest set. And we say, okay, rank this mechanic on a scale from 1 to 7. Okay, so above 6, amazing, really good mechanic. 5.5 to 6.0, very good. We're really happy with that. Even 5.0 to 5.5, it's good. We're happy with it. Okay, what did Megamorph rate? A 3.83, which at the time was the lowest rating we had ever gotten. So the interesting thing about this is, like I said, it's not a bad mechanic. It's not that it plays badly. It doesn't play badly. It plays fine. So I don't think it's an example of bad design. I think it's an example of bad salesmanship. And that's the lesson of Megamorph, that if you have expectation, if you set up things for your audience, you have to follow through. And even if you give them a good mechanic, if it's not what they expect, they won't like it. And that Megamorph, once again, it's on my list, not because it's sort of a bad mechanic, but it didn't meet the needs, and the audience really didn't like it. Okay, number 18, Companion. An Ikoria of April 2020. So we were doing a monster theme, and one of the subtypes of monster stories is when you have bonders, where you have characters, sometimes children, but they bond with the monsters. And the monsters are nice, and they bond with them. So we made a mechanic to represent this whole thing. We called it Companion. So the idea was this card sat outside the game, and as long as your deck met certain requirements, you could cast it. And the idea was we had to have a deck restriction, though. It needed to be thematic. It needed to be something you could build around. It needed to be something we can mechanically tie into on the Companion. And most importantly, it had to be something the opponent can monitor. Like, you can have 5 goblins is a bad thing because your opponent doesn't know until you play the 6th goblin that your deck's illegal. We had to make sure that your opponent could monitor and understand if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. I will say we did not hit the dartboard with this one. Megamorph got a 3.83 on the set assessment, the lowest we'd ever gotten at the time. What did Companion get? 2.74. The new record for the lowest ever rating we've gotten on Mechanic. Also, it got banned in a lot of formats. It is the only mechanic where we errated the entire mechanic. Not a sign, by the way, that things went well. So we made a miscalculation. Actually, we made 2 miscalculations. One is adding another card was just way better than we thought, which is funny because we have a history of not valuing card advantage. Also, number 2 is I think the puzzle to solve was a little bit too easy for a lot of the cards. The hoop was a little too simple to jump through. For example, take Lutri. You have to not have 2 of the same card. How could you ever do that in a format? How could that be possible? Also, in the same set, we added Mutate. Mutate was on my short list. It's not in the top 20, but it's a complicated mechanic. And I think we just put a little bit too much on the plate of play design, and that play design did a lot of work to make Mutate work, and they kind of ran out of time for Companion. So anyway, Companion, my number 18. Number 17, Haunt. This is from Guild Pact in January of 2006. Okay, so we were trying to make a mechanic for the Orzhov Syndicate in Ravnica. Okay, so it can go on. Haunt says when this card is put into your graveyard, you could haunt a creature. So it went on creatures. It has an effect when they enter. They exile. When they die, they exile and they haunt a creature. You kind of put it underneath the creature, and then when you repeat the enter effect when the haunted creature dies. Except that's how it worked on creatures. On spells, because it also goes on spells, they have an effect when you cast them. They exile after you cast them, you exile them and haunt a creature. And then when the creature dies, it does the effect of the spell when you cast it. So a couple problems here. These are similar, but they're not quite the same. They sort of match the flavor, but not exactly. And the space between the initial casting and the death effect can be pretty lengthy. So the gap between them causes problems. So this problem is what I call a stickiness problem. So the human brain is good at understanding things, but it has blind spots. So when you give it something, you want it to say back what it's getting. And sometimes it has trouble with that. When things aren't sticky, there's something about the way you've made it that the brain just can't remember it. And Haunt's a perfect example. Most of you out there, if I said, I just told you how it works, but if I asked you how Haunt works, you would have trouble remembering. It didn't help that there were 2 different ways it worked, but it's just, there's something about it, it's hard to remember in your brain. And normally that's a sign for us as designers that it's just doing something it shouldn't be doing. But that is why it's my number 17, Haunt. Number 16, Annihilator. So this is from Rise of the Eldrazi in April 2010. Okay, so this block, Zendikar was a new plane, Whirlwick was the same plane, and the original plan for Rise of the Eldrazi was a different plane with all new mechanics. That was the original plan. But then Brady Dommermuth was our creative director at the time, said, we only have 4 people. We can't make 2 worlds in 1 year. By the way, we have way more than 4 people now, so we can. So he said, what if we make an event so large in impact, it justifies completely changing the focus and changing all the mechanics. So they looked at, when we made Zendikar originally, there were all these little hedrons in it. I think they put them originally because they thought they looked cool. But they said, what if these hedrons did something? What if they were a prison for an ancient evil? Something that was menacing the planet and was locked away. Something called the Eldrazi. So the Eldrazi were defined by 4 traits. They were ancient. They were alien, hard to fathom. They were giant, they were huge. And they were hungry. They liked to eat planes. So the question was, how do we capture this in a mechanic? So the mechanic we did was Annihilator. So it was Annihilator N, a number. And whenever this creature attacked, defending player sacrifices that many permanents. So the problem with something like Annihilator 4 is it could have just said, opponent loses the game but doesn't know it yet. So it talks a little bit about inevitability. If the game's going to end the game. It's not fun to basically end the game but make people play for a lot more turns when it's going to happen anyway. And so Annihilator, that was the core problem. We did bring Annihilator back a little bit in Modern Horizons 3 because we were bringing the Eldrazi back. But notice, we only did Annihilator 1 and 2. We didn't do any big Annihilator because it's just not fun. Okay, number 15, Devoid, speaking of Eldrazi. Okay, so this was Battle for Zendikar in October 2015. We were, again, back on Zendikar. Remember, this was the block that we had. Okay, at the end of that block, the event that Brady had talked about is the Eldrazi escaped their prison and were waging war on the world of Zendikar. In the Rise of Eldrazi, we had 15 Eldrazi creatures, 9 of which were colorless, and the smallest colorless was a 7/7, and then all colorless had Annihilator. Okay, but for Battle for Zendikar, we were planning to have a lot more. So let's look at how did we define them in Rise of the Eldrazi. We gave them type Eldrazi. We said they were colorless. We gave them a generic cost. They were huge. They were giant creatures. They had cast triggers, a lot of them, at least the main Eldrazi, and they had Annihilator. Okay, I just explained we didn't like Annihilator, so we didn't want to bring Annihilator back. And huge creatures, like if we're going to do a lot of them, they can't all be huge. And cast triggers is not something we want to do in low rarity. And they all couldn't be generic. If we're doing too many of them, we've learned this from artifact sets, they can't all be generic. So what do we have left? We had type Eldrazi and colorless. Not a lot to work with. And so reminder, by the way, Rise of Eldrazi had 15 Eldrazi. Battle for Zendikar had 51. Okay, so we had to solve this problem. So what did we do? Okay, so we said, we're going to make a bunch of different Eldrazi. They'll have the main titans, but then we'll have extensions of them was the flavor. And we said, okay, we'll use the Eldrazi creature types, one of the few things we still had. We'd make smaller Eldrazi, they didn't all have to be huge. And then we made a very important decision. We said, look, some of them are going to have to cost colored mana. But we only had 2 things that defined them that we were going to do. So we said, well, we still need them to be colorless. So even though they cost colored mana, let's make them colorless. And then we gave them effects that cared about colorlessness, so it mattered that they were colorless. And we gave them cool names. And so the idea is we set them up. But then, right before the set was going to finish in development, the rules people said, you know what, we really need to define this. Let's give it a mechanic. We'll call it Devoid. Okay, so we preview the set. And the player base says, ooh, a new mechanic called Devoid. What does it do? And we're like, it's colorless. And they're like, and what else? And we're like, that's it. And they're like, so the mechanic doesn't do anything? It doesn't have an additional function. It's just colorless. So it doesn't do anything else. No. So it didn't go over well. Players like their mechanics to do things, kind of a thing we learned. What I learned in retrospect is I wish we had made it a super type and not a keyword. Because super types have less expectation, and that we still could have, we have super types that carry rules baggage. You can do that. So I wish we had done that. So the rule here is one of functionality. Like, being a mechanic has some weight. And the low bar is it does something. And being colorless just wasn't enough of a thing. That is why Devoid is number 15. Number 14, Partner. Okay, so this was for Commander 2016, which came out in November 2016. Okay, a little trivia question. How many years did Magic exist before the first 4-color card was created? So I'll give you a little guidance here. 2-color cards, the first one was in Legends in 1994, so 1 year after Magic came out. 3-color was also in Legends in 1994, 1 year. 5-color didn't happen until Stronghold on Sliver Queen, which is 1998, which was 5 years later. Okay, so let's guess. When did 4-color finally happen? The answer is in Guild Pact in 2006, 13 years later. And it was the Nephilim. So we made a cycle of 4-color creatures. We didn't make them legendary. We regret that later. Okay, so in 2006, we had 5 4-color creatures. Okay, let's go 10 years later when the set was coming out. How many 4-color creatures did we have? 5. That was it. In 10 years, we had made no more. It took 13 years to make 5, and it took 10 more years to still make 5. So 23 years in, we had 5. So in Commander, we did make a cycle of them. We doubled the number in existence. But they're hard to design. 4-color is very hard to design. So we said, let's make a mechanic that will help us. So we made a mechanic called partner. And the way partner works is you can have two legendary creatures both be your commander. As long as they have partner, they can be commanders together. So in the set, we had 15 cards with partner, 1 cycle of allied color, and 2 cycles of enemy color. And we made them 2 color because we were trying to let you make 4 color combinations. That was the whole point. We're trying to make 4 color combinations. Okay, what was the problem? I would argue we had a math problem and another miscalculation problem. So math and miscalculation. Here's the math problem, what I call a combinatorics problem. If you have 2 cards with partner, how many combinations can you join them together? 1, they go together. If you have 3 possibilities. 4 is 6 possibilities. 5 is 10 possibilities. 15 cards is 105 possibilities. What this means is for every nth card, you add n possibilities. So it just slowly gets more and more out of control. Also, there's a miscalculation. So Time of the Weaver. If you were building a deck with Time of the Weaver, by the way, I forgot to count colorless cards. So this is just colored cards in their color identity. You had 11,632 cards to choose from. So let's say you add Thrasos. How many more cards can you consider? 11,447. So it's a 98% increase. So the math was just bad. It just was too much. The change was too much. So we've learned we can do it in smaller numbers. We can do Friends Forever. We can do Choose a Background. We can do Doctor's Companion. Like, we can do it if it's more contained. We also learned retrospectively that it actually works best on monocolored creatures because the shift between them is a lot less. A, they have less cards they can do, and when you combine them, there's less cards you can make. Also, single card commanders are difficult. So Commander 2016, I believe they had a path, and we just picked the wrong path. And we ended up being a problem. And so that is why that was number 14. Okay, number 13, Miracle. Okay, this is Avacyn Restored back in May 2012. Okay, so Miracle, you can cast the card for its Miracle cost when you draw it if it's the first card you draw through this turn. Okay, but the story begins back in Tempest in October of '97. So Richard Garfield and I were on the Tempest design team, and we made a brand new mechanic we called draw triggers. So here's how draw triggers work. They have an effect when you cast them, but they have an effect when you draw them. Maybe it's positive, you gain life. Maybe it's negative, it does damage to you. But it allowed you to do a lot of interesting things. Like lightning, this is a redone lightning blast, obviously, but oh wow, you could do 4 damage for only 2. Oh, but it does 2 damage when you draw it. Okay, but there are some problems we had to solve with this. First off, let's say I draw a lightning blast and I'm at 2 life. I'm supposed to die. Now, if I'm an honest person, I go, oh, I drew a lightning blast, I took 2 damage, I'm dead, you win. But let's say you weren't quite as honest as me. What you would do is you just wouldn't tell them. You'd never cast it, but you just keep it in your hand. And we're like, well, we can't have draw triggers, they don't trigger. And so we had a lot of questions of how do you do that. So Richard and I actually entertained changing the back for the draw trigger cards, because at the time, sleeves existed, but opaque sleeves didn't exist yet. And we're like, oh, if you see one of these, you know it's one. Hey, show me that card. I know that's what it is. We thought about not doing negative ones. We tried a lot of different things. But in the end, we admitted defeat. But over the years, whenever a new designer would come, they'd get the idea. Hey, how about draw triggers? And I would watch them try to figure it out until they admitted defeat. But then one day, Brian Tinsman came to he's a former designer. Brian said, how about draw triggers? But Brian was more stubborn than the rest of us. So he figured out a way to do it in Avacyn Restored. So the idea, once again, with Miracle, the problem with Miracle is what I call a physicality problem. So let me explain. Okay, so you have your hand, and you have your library. Okay, let's say the top card of your library is a card with Miracle. Okay, so when you draw it, you're able to use it. So you put it in your hand, but wait, it's too late. Once it's in your hand, how do you know that that's the card you drew this turn? So what happened was you sort of had to go halfway, and then you had to look at it. And you had to change how you drew cards so that you could play it correctly. But the problem was worse. I need to make sure that it's a miracle. But the problem is worse than that. Let's say you're not even playing miracles, but you don't want your opponent to know that you're not playing miracles. You still have to peek at it. And so we changed the way people had to draw cards. That is horrible. And I talked earlier about logistics. The physicality is also important too. What do you make people do? And making people reinvent how they play Magic is just not good. That's why Miracle's number 13. Okay, next is Forecast at number 12. This is from Dissension in May 2006. So back in Unglued, I made a card called Infernal Spawn of Evil. The story behind it is there's an artist named Ron Spencer, and he was assigned a card called Entropic Spectre. As a joke, when he turned into Sketch, he turned into this little mouse drinking cocoa. A day later, he turned into the real Sketch. But the art director hung it on his wall. We thought it was funny. So when I was making Unglued, I went to Ron Spencer and I said, I want that mouse. Draw me that mouse. And the whole idea, the whole joke of the card was, this is the most evil creature that ever existed. So we called it Infernal Spawn of Evil. And we gave it was flying, first striking, 7/7. It cost 9 mana. It was intimidating. The problem was, you're not going to play that very often. So I wanted to use some ability, and it was an onset. So I said, okay, you could reveal it from your hand and say, it's coming. And the idea is, just the mere thought that one day they might see it is so scary that they lose a life. So flash ahead to Dissension, we were doing the Azoria Senate, and we thought about maybe doing something in the hand, because white and blue like the hand. And so we thought back to Infernal Spawn of Evil. So we made Forecast. So Forecast, you reveal a card from your hand, and then you generate an effect. And then eventually you could cast it, and usually that effect tied into what you were doing from your hand. Okay, so the problem here is what we call a repetition of play problem. So in Magic, you make a deck. You shuffle your deck. You have your library. You draw a hand. The idea that it's randomized is really important. We want every game to play out differently. But if every turn you're doing the same thing, it kind of gets monotonous. And there's a lot of ways this can happen. Maybe you're doing the exact same thing every turn. Maybe every game plays out the same. There's a lot of mechanics we made that just make the same thing happen game after game or turn after turn. Also, there was a very narrow design space because it had to be an effect that made sense in your hand and that tied into the larger effect when you played the card. And there just wasn't a lot of things that did that. So that is why Forecast is my number 12. Number 11, Initiative. This is from Dungeons & Dragons Battle for Baldur's Gate, June 2022. So the idea was it said you take the initiative. What does that mean? What it means is whenever you take it, you go into the Undercity. What is the Undercity? It is a dungeon. And you go in the first room, and then you do the effect of that first room. Then you have a choice which room you go into. And you choose one of them and do that effect. And then you keep choosing where you go until you get through it. Also, whenever one of your opponents deal damage to you, they could steal the initiative. So this card was based on 2 old mechanics. One from Adventures of the Forgotten Realm called Adventure in the Dungeon. That's where dungeons got created. And the other was from Conspiracy Take the Crown, a mechanic called Become the Monarch. And the Monarch, you got to draw a card every turn, but your opponent, when they hit you, would steal it from you. And the idea, and this, by the way, was taken from a Richard Garfield game called Vampire the Eternal Struggle. There's a mechanic in it called The Edge that did something similar. That's where Monarch came from. Anyway, here is the problem. We designed this card for Commander. Commander is a multiplayer format. Politics are a key part of Commander. And so the initiative actually played great in Commander. But there are other formats. Take Vintage. Vintage is a 2-player format. It is a strategic format, and it's a lot easier to lock down the board. So the idea is, if you get the Undercity, it's a lot easier to do all the effects. And so it ended up being overpowered. So the problem here is what we call an adaptation problem. When we make Magic cards, they're not just for one format. Any format can play them a lot of the time, or many formats can play them. So we have to be careful. And the problem with Initiative is we made a mechanic for Commander that caused problems in Vintage. And that was a problem. Okay, number 7, Cleave. So this is from Innistrad Crimson Bound, November 2021. So the way it works is there's a cost that you can pay so you can eliminate the bracket. Let me explain what that means. So this card says destroy all creatures with mana value 2 or less. So if you cast it normally, that's what you do. Destroy all creatures with mana value 2 or less. But if you cast the Cleave cost, you eliminate the bracketed text. So now it destroys all creatures. Okay, so Crimson Vow, by the way, they were missing a mechanic. And so they needed a spell mechanic, a mana sink, and something flashy. That was what they were looking for. Meanwhile, in New Capenna, we were in exploratory design, working on the brokers. So at that point, the brokers were not lawyers, they were corrupt cops. It turned out the real world, corrupt cops became kind of a thing we didn't want to deal with, and so we changed them to lawyers. But during that time, Ari Nee, who won the 3rd Great Designer Search, she made a mechanic called misconduct. And the idea was you, the corrupt cops, could break your own laws, and that was the flavor of misconduct. So that got turned into a Cleave. So here's the problem. One is a grokkability problem. The term grok comes from Stranger in Strange Land by Robert Heinlein. It means to like understand something, kind of like organically understand it. The problem with this is pay more for less text is really hard to grok. This card gets better by removing words from it. It's hard to understand. Also, there was an incongruity problem. Okay, this was the vampire wedding set. Okay, there were vampire typo. It's a vampire set. Makes sense. Blood counters. Okay, that makes sense. They're vampires. Exploit. Sure, I get that. Transform. Yeah, they turn into bats and things. Disturb. Vampire's pretty disturbing. Daybound, Nightbound. Yes, they live in the night. And Cleave. Now, I get that Soren likes his swords and stuff, but it just didn't make sense. It just wasn't connective. So it was kind of ungrokkable. It was incongruous, and it just didn't come together. And it was a clever idea that maybe in the right place with the right support, but this wasn't the right place, and it wasn't the right support. Okay, number 9, what I call the Unmemorable mechanics. So when I made this, I made a short list of mechanics that I was considering, and I found a bunch of them that I just couldn't remember what they did. So for example, Cohort is from Oath of the Gatewatch, and you can tap and untap ally as an effect for the cost. Conspire is from Shadowmoor. You can tap 2 creatures that share a color with the spell to copy the spell. Pack Tactics is from Forgotten Realms. When you attack, as long as you attack with more than 6 powerful creatures, it triggers. Reinforce is from Morning Tide. It's like a cycling variant, but you get +1/+1 counters. Support is from Oath of the Gatewatch. Support N means put a +1/+1 counter on N creatures. One of the lessons is we want mechanics to be memorable. We want you to remember the mechanic. So when things are lost to time, when no one remembers what they do, it's a sign that you just can't remember them. And I didn't think they were worthy of a whole category, so I grouped them all together. There's mechanics that we just don't remember. Number 8, Epic. So this is from Saviors of Kamigawa in May of 2005. Okay, so in 1994, Legends premiered, and it made legendary lands. It also had creatures, although they technically weren't legendary. They were summoned legend at the time. But later, we would make them legendary. Stronghold introduced legendary artifacts. Champions of Kamigawa introduced legendary enchantments. But Brian Tinsman, who worked on the set, realized that there were 2 card types at the time. Planeswalkers didn't exist yet, and Kindred and stuff. There were 2 ones that did. So he set out to make a legendary sorcery. Now, this mechanic didn't end up being legendary, but that was his inspiration. He called it Epic. Okay, what does Epic do? At the beginning of each of your upkeeps, copy this spell. Well, how much does that cost? For free. Well, how often do I do it? For the rest of the game. Well, what are the effects like? They're huge effects. Okay, so any downside? Yes, one thing. For the rest of the game, you can't cast spells. That's a record scratch, by the way. So there's a little saying that I like. If you take a thimbleful of wine and you put it into a barrel full of sewage, you get sewage. If you take a thimbleful of sewage and you put it into a barrel full of wine, you get sewage. So the lesson here is one of appeal. I think 95% of what he made was wine, but 5% was sewage, and that was enough. And that all of your mechanic has to be appealing. if a little bit isn't appealing, that is a problem. And that's why Epic is number 8. Okay, next up, Fateful Hour. So this was in Dark Ascension in February of 2012. So remember, this was an Innistrad, the home of monsters. And the humans were important because, A, all the monsters had previously been humans, and they were the victims of the monsters. So to show the difference between Innistrad and Dark Ascension, in Innistrad, this was the leader of the humans, Machias. But things got worse in Dark Ascension. Do you guys remember what happened to Machias? This happened to Machias. So the idea was that the humans were on the brink of destruction. Things were going horrible because of all sorts of things. And the humans, we wanted to reflect the humans being at their absolute lowest point. So we made a mechanic called Fateful Hour. As long as you have 5 or less life, something. Here's the problem we ran into. So there's different parts of the game. We were very focused on this little tiny part of the game. And it was a time problem. That the window of opportunity just wasn't big enough. That it just didn't happen enough. By the time you were 5 life, you're like that close to being dead. And when you make a mechanic, you want significance. The mechanic has to matter for enough time, and it just didn't. We had a good idea, we executed on it poorly. So that is why Fateful Hour is number 7. Next up, Daybound, Nightbound. Okay. This was in Innistrad Midnight Hunt in September 2021. But let's go back to Innistrad before that, September 2011. So like I said, these were the main monsters of the set. And we had done vampires before. We had done zombies. But werewolves, we hadn't given them their due. There had been 3 werewolves before Innistrad, and they all sucked. So we borrowed something from, we have a Duel Masters is a game we make at Wizards, only for the Japanese market. And they had come up with double-face technology. And so what if on one side you have a human, and the other side you have a werewolf, and the human turns into the werewolf, and the werewolf can turn into the human. It's pretty cool. And we wanted to come up with a mechanic that represented this. So the idea was the human becomes a werewolf at night. So when things are quiet, when no spells are being cast, that represents the quiet of the night, and he becomes the werewolf. And then, when things get busy, when there's 2 or more spells, that represents the busyness of the daytime, and the werewolf becomes the human. Okay, but in Midnight Hunt, we were trying to evolve that idea. So we said, okay, instead of writing this out, what if we keyword it? What if we just take the mechanic we had and name it? And the idea was we made a 2-sided thing to aid you and added rules to it. And it let us make single-face cards that cared. Now we can make cards that cared about day or night that weren't werewolves. And because it was a keyword, it was easier to fit on cards. Okay, we made 2 mistakes. Number 1, we made werewolves inconsistent. Because night says, permanents enter the battlefield nightbound. Originally, by the way, day said on it, all werewolves become humans. And night on it said, all humans become werewolves. That's what it said when we turned it over. But they had to simplify it. They were trying to get less text on the cards. And so it was easier to say, permanents enter the battlefield nightbound. So the problem is, that on the left is Outbound Liberator from the later set, and Mayor of Averbrook's from Innistrad. Okay, so night says it's nighttime. So, okay, what happens to the Outbound Liberator? Why, it enters as a Frenzied Trapbreaker. It is night. It is nightbound. It enters on its werewolf side. How about Mayor of Averbrook? He's still Mayor of Averbrook. And so that inconsistency was a problem. We want consistency. It bothered me to no end they were inconsistent. I tried my hardest to eradicate the old werewolves to Daybound Nightbound, and I failed to that mission. I still regret that to this day. Okay, number 2, it forces unnecessary tracking. So on the card, once again, to save words, originally it said, hey, only track this while there's things that care about it. But that was too wordy, so we shortened it. We said, well, just do it for the rest of the game. But what that means is, if your creatures die and there's nothing Nightbound or Daybound, you still have to track it. Because, once again, because of Nightbound, maybe I get a werewolf, maybe it matters. And so it made a lot of busy work, but most of the time it doesn't matter. And that's an efficiency problem. Magic is difficult enough. If we're going to make you do work that matters. Don't make you do mindless work. And that is why Day My Nightbot is number 6. Number 5, Radiance. So this is some original Ravnica back in 2005. Okay, we were doing the Boris Legion. So in it, at the time, Richard Garfield made a mechanic for the Boris Legion. Convoke. I like Convoke a lot, but I really thought it was a Selesnya mechanic, so I moved to Selesnya. So we were trying to figure out a mechanic to represent the Boros. They were the soldiers. And so Mike Elliott came up with Radiance. So what Radiance says is target creature, and each other creature that shares a color with it, get a bonus. I think he was thinking like, oh, it's the armies working together. I think it was the thought process. So let me explain the problem. So let's say I have a Wojek Siren, and I have 3 creatures. I have a Frenzy Goblin, a Boros Guild Mage, and a Conclave Equinox. A 1/1, a 2/2, and a 3/3. Okay, let's say I cast the Siren on the Frenzy Goblin. It's red, so all my red creatures get a bonus. So now I have a 2/2, a 3/3, and a 3/3. Or I could cast on my Conclave Equinox. And then all my white creatures get a bonus. So now I have a 1/1, a 3/3, and a 4/4. Or I could cast on my Boros Guild Mage. And then my red creatures and my white creatures, but not double counting red and white, get a bonus. So I had 2/2, a 3/3, and a 4/4. And remember, by the way, this is before we did effect located to your side. So not only did it affect your creatures, it affected your opponent's creatures of those colors. And by the way, originally when Mike made this mechanic, it cared about not just color, but also creature type. Okay, so the problem here is there's 3 different outcomes based on where you cast. It's just really complicated. It's impossible to track. It's just hard to follow. And so, hey, we need you to be able to play the mechanics in a way that makes sense. It's okay to make you think, but we shouldn't make you think too much. Also, in the end, I don't think it had a lot of flavor to it. I mean, the idea of the army working together didn't really come through. So that is why Radiance is number 5. Okay, number 4, Recover. So this is from Cold Snap in July of 2006. So we had a hole in our calendar. And what happened was, by the way, like maybe like a year earlier, we said to our, at the time the brand team said, do you want us to make a set in July of that year? They go, no. And we go, okay. And then it was something like May. They're like, we did a set in July. So we knew it needed to be a small set. It needed a draft by itself. And it needed to not be a new world. We just didn't have time to make a new world. So we came up with this idea. At the time, all our blocks had 3 sets. But Ice Age, which was kind of the first sort of block, only had 2 sets. It had Ice Age and Alliances. And the idea of missing episodes was a thing, right? Oh, we found the lost episode. So we did this thing where we said, oh, it's the lost Ice Age set. We found it in a file cabinet or something. Which, by the way, was a joke. We made a mistake. We had Randy Bueller write the article, and Randy was very straight-faced, so everybody thought we were lying to them. Like that wasn't really from a... Like, no, the whole thing was a joke, but Randy didn't sell that well. Okay, so we looked at it, and we were trying to take mechanics from Ice Age. So cumulative upkeep, snow, cantrips, pitch cards, we put them all in, but there wasn't enough. So we started looking at individual cards. So one of the cards that caught the attention of the development team was Death Spark. So this has a little thing that says, if Death Spark's in your graveyard with a creature card directly above it, you could pay mana to return it to your hand. So this uses a thing we call Graveyard Order Matters. There are 21 cards out of 27,000. There are 21 cards in the history of Magic that do it. The last one was Volrath Shapeshifter, which was printed in Stronghold in 1998. So many years before this. Anyway, during development, Devin Lowe, which was one of the developers, came up with a mechanic. So here's how Recover worked. At the beginning of your upkeep, if this card is in your graveyard with a creature directly on top of it, you may pay N to return it to your hand. Let's make Death Spark the mechanic. Okay, I had just become head designer. I became head designer like in the middle of Champions Block. So I said no. I go, we are not adding Graveyard Horde Magic back to Magic. We got rid of it for a good reason. We're not undoing all that work. So I started hacking away at it, and I made a version that I thought was similar, that didn't require Graveyard Order Matter, and that's what we went with. Looking back, that was not the right move. this is the right move. We should have thrown it away. It was, I mean, if we're not going to do what it was, and we shouldn't make Graveyard Order matter again, we just should have looked for something else. There were other cards in the set. We should have looked for other inspiration. It didn't clear the bar. Like, mechanics have to be worth it. And this mechanic it wasn't worth it. And it wasn't a fun mechanic. It wasn't easy to track. It just wasn't worth it. So that is why Recover is number 4. Number 3, Sweep. This is Saviors of Kamigawa from May 2005. So it had a mechanic we called Wisdom. It wasn't a named mechanic, but you cared about how big your hand was. So Sweep, oh, by the way, normally when I do the slide, I just pick 3 cards from it to show it to you. I might as well just done this. This is all the Sweep cards. There are 4 Sweep cards. Sweep basically meant you could return any number of lands to your hand to generate an effect. And the idea is, oh, I care about how big my hand is, so I could return 4 lands and put it in my hand. Okay, so let me explain why this was a mistake. So in Zendikar, years later, it was called the land set. I called it Landsapalooza. We tried out 40 land mechanics, and Landfall came from that. So we learned a really important lesson, which was, don't let people mess with their mana. The reason is, it never goes well. Basically, people will mana screw themselves and lose the game and not understand why they lost the game and just not have fun. And we named this lesson. The lesson was named the Sweep Rule. So here's a good tip. When you name a rule about what not to do in design after a mechanic, that mechanic ends up on a list. So this is about responsibility. We want to make sure that we're making mechanics that you all want to play. We want to make things, and that I understand there's spiky players out there, but if most of the players will play it wrong, or it makes them play the game in a way that's going to be unfun for them, it is our responsibility as designers to not make that mechanic. And we failed on Sweep, which is why it's number 3. Number 2, Gotcha. By the way, of the 20 mechanics, I was responsible for 10 of these, so I'm not trying to lay off. I made a lot of these. Okay, so Gotcha was unhinged back in November 2004. So here's how it worked. So Gotcha was a mechanic that said, whenever an opponent does a thing, you say Gotcha. So the idea was the card's in your graveyard, and then this particular card cared about your opponent saying either the word kill or destroy. So when they say the word, you say Gotcha, and then the card goes from your graveyard into your hand. So whenever an opponent says a word, says a number, touches the table, touches their face, flicks their cards, laughs, whenever they laugh, if your opponent laughs, you get to say Gotcha and put the card back in your hand. Okay, so what happens when you make a mechanic that you punish people for laughing or talking? They just clam up. So the lesson here is one of motivation. Our goal as a designer is we want you to have fun. And it's not your job to have fun. It is our job to make sure you have fun. So we want to make sure that the game goes through the fun center. That whatever's fun about the game, we have to make you go there. And the problem with Gotcha is the exact opposite. It literally made you go to the unfun part. And the worst part about this, by the way, the thing that claws at my soul, is we did a play test where I got the note of why don't we just, why will people talk? And I said, oh, no, they'll play in the spirit of the card. And it's an unset. People won't do that. And of course they did that because people like to win. So of course they did that. And that wasn't the player's fault. That was my fault. I gave them a mechanic that told them to do the unfun thing. That is not on you guys. That is not the player's fault. I, as a designer, failed. I made you be unfun. That's on me. Okay, number 1, bands with others. Okay, so this came out in Legends of June of 94, but our story starts back in Alpha of 93. Okay, so Richard Garfield made a mechanic called banding. For some reason, though, it says bands on the card. I don't understand that. Okay, so how does banding work? Don't worry, the Alpha rulebook has you covered. Right here. Okay. So it says, banding. I'm reading the actual text from the rulebook. If you want to learn how to play, this is what it told you. Creatures only banned for the duration of a single attack. Banded creatures do not gain abilities of other creatures in the band. You got it? Okay, wait. They gave an example. A Mesa Pegasus, a flying creature with banding ability, bands with a Benelish hero, a non-flying creature with banding ability, and a Shannon Dryad, a non-flying creature with forest walk ability. So you have these three things. Mesa Pegasus has flying and banding, Benelish hero has banding, Shannon Dryad has forest walk. Forest walk means you can't block if they have a forest. It's an old school mechanic. Okay, the hero cannot fly or forest walk. All of the banned creatures can be blocked by any creature that can block the hero. But the attacker gets to choose how the damage from the blocking creature distributed among the banded creatures. Okay, a couple things. Attacking and blocking didn't even work the same, so that was lying to you. And how banding interacted with other things kept changing. Like, there was a period in time where banding stopped trample, then it didn't stop trample, and anyway, it kept changing. It's not a stickiness problem, by the way. It's a complexity problem. Stickiness means it's hard to remember because we didn't do something right. This is just too complex. Now, the reason I know it's too complex is because of the 1995 World Championship, I was a judge. The #1 rule question I got of the best players in the world was, how does banding work? And they did not understand it, not even close. Okay, banding is not even in my list. This isn't even about banding. That's just the premise. I considered putting banding on the list, but I considered there's something fun about banding. There's a neat idea about banding. In general, that's a cool thing. So I didn't put it on my list. But bands with others, oh my goodness. Okay, bands with others. So Legends did, so in bands, here's how it works. You would have cards. This particular card makes a token that makes bands with wolves, makes wolf tokens with bands with other wolves. Now, there was every Legends pack had a rule card in it, and it does explain this is a limited form of the banding ability. Okay, so let's say I make a wolf with bands with other wolves. Okay, Master of the Hunt makes a wolf of the hunt. Can these guys band together? No. Okay, let's say I have it doesn't have bands with others. Let's say I have a bear with bands with other bears and a wolf with bands with other wolves. Okay, they both have bands with other. Can they band together? No. Interestingly, they could both band individually with a banding creature. Okay, let's try something else. Let's say I have bands with other bears and a bear. Can the bands with other bears band with the bear? No. Bands with other bears can only band with other creatures that have bands with other bears. And that creature doesn't even need to be a bear. So obviously there's a huge complexity problem. There were some stability issues. It's just not intuitive. The reason this was my #1 is we took an ability that was one of the most complex abilities Magic had ever made, but at least that had flavor. There was something about banding. And made a mechanic that made absolutely no sense. It didn't work the way you thought. So anyway, bands with others is, I don't know how many on the planet could actually tell me how bands with others work. A, because you have to understand banding, and I don't think most people can explain banding. But bands with others is not even, makes no sense there. So, okay, as I did last time, for those who want to take a picture, these are the 20 worst mechanics, according to me. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this talk. I like to give sort of informative things. If you enjoy hearing me talk about mechanics, I have a podcast called Drive to Work, where twice a week I do this on my drive to work. I also have a weekly column called Making Magic, where I talk about it. I have a daily blog called Blogatog, where I answer questions every day about stuff like this. So if you want to hear me talk about more things about mechanics, I give you endless places to do that. But anyway, thank you so much for coming to MagicCon, and I hope you have a great time.